Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you're here with me today because there's another story coming up that will blow your mind. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss any more episodes. Today, we're taking a look at one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history, a case that divided the public into two camps and continues to spark debate to this day. We're going to talk about Leslie Van Houten, a young girl who, at the age of 19, became a member of the notorious Manson family and participated in brutal murders that shocked the world. But what is so fascinating about this case? Leslie was not your typical criminal. She came from a normal family, had a decent background, and before meeting Charles Manson, there was no indication that she would become a killer. So, how could an ordinary teenager turn into a member of a murderous cult? After more than 53 years behind bars, she was finally released on parole in 2023. Did she deserve a second chance? Was she a victim of manipulation or fully responsible for her actions? These are the questions we will answer together today. Get ready for a story full of manipulation, drugs, violence, but also repentance and controversy. A story about the thin line between innocence and evil. So get comfortable, because this will be a ride you won't soon forget. Now let's delve into the dark world of the Manson family and find out who Leslie Van Houten really was. Now we come to the heart of the story, the Manson family. And I have to tell you, the more I learned about this group, the scarier it all got. Because they weren't just a bunch of criminals. They were a perfectly functioning sect with their own rules, hierarchy, and twisted ideology that turned ordinary young people into devoted followers capable of anything. Charles Manson as a charismatic leader. Let's first talk about the man who ran it all. Charles Manson. Manson was no ordinary criminal. He was a master manipulator, a man who could read people like an open book and knew exactly how to bring them under his control. If you look at old photographs of him, you see a tiny man with piercing eyes and wild hair. He wasn't physically imposing, but he had something that drew people in like a magnet. Manson had a hard life of violence and crime. He spent most of his life in prisons and correctional facilities, but it was there that he learned to survive, manipulate, and control others. When he was released in the year 1967, he found himself in the middle of the hippie movement in San Francisco, and this was his golden environment. What made Manson so dangerous? He was incredibly charismatic. He could talk for hours and hours, weaving together philosophy, religion, music, and his own distorted visions. He presented himself as a kind of messiah, someone who had come to save the world. He had the ability to see into people's weaknesses. He saw who felt lost, who was searching for meaning in life, who needed love and acceptance. And that's exactly what he offered them. Manson used various techniques to maintain control. He presented himself as a loving father figure, but he was also unpredictable and at times violent. This combination of love and fear created a toxic addiction. His followers both adored and feared him. Manson also claimed to have a connection to Jesus Christ and to understand the hidden messages in the Beatles' music. Yes, you heard that right, the Beatles. We'll get to that. Life at Spahn Ranch. When Manson started building his family, he needed a place where they could all live together. And he found it. Spahn Ranch. This place became the symbol of the Manson family and the center of all the evil that would later take place. Spahn Ranch was an old Western movie ranch northwest of Los Angeles. It belonged to an 80-year-old nearly blind owner named George Spahn. The ranch was in a state of disrepair. Old wooden buildings, abandoned Western sets, dust and heat. But it was perfect for Manson. It was isolated, far from civilization, and George Spahn was too old and blind to care what happened there. Manson made a deal with George. They could live there in exchange for help with the ranch. But most importantly, Manson put some of the young women in his group there to take care of the old man. If you know what I mean. George was alone, vulnerable, and because of the attention of the young girls, he was willing to turn a blind eye to everything that was going on his property. Life at Spahn Ranch was a bizarre mix of hippie commune and militant camp. During the day, it seemed like an innocent hippie community. People walked around naked or half-naked. Music was playing. Everyone shared everything. There was no private property. Everything belonged to the family. The women cooked, cleaned, and took care of the men. Yes, despite the hippie ideals of equality, the Manson family was deeply sexist. Women were subservient to men, and especially to Manson. They slept in old Western sets, trailers, or right under the stars. Food was scarce, and they often had to beg or even steal. Manson called it getting. He would send his followers to go into town and get food, clothing, or whatever they needed. Often this meant rummaging through supermarket bins or stealing. But there were more than just innocent hippie activities going on at the ranch. Manson held regular ceremonies there, where everyone would do drugs and he would talk to them for hours. He also trained them in the use of knives and guns. Yes, you heard right. These hippies were taught to fight. Manson was paranoid and believed they had to be prepared for the coming apocalypse. The helter-skelter race war theory. And now, we come to the most bizarre part of the whole Manson family ideology, the helter-skelter theory. This is so insane that when I first read about it, I couldn't believe anyone could take it seriously. But Manson's followers believed it wholeheartedly. Helter Skelter is the title of a Beatles song from their White Album of 1968. It's just a rock song about a roller coaster at an amusement park. But Manson was obsessed with the Beatles and believed that their songs contained hidden messages meant for him. And Helter Skelter, he believed, predicted the coming race war in America. According to Manson's twisted logic, an apocalyptic war was about to break out between blacks and whites. Blacks were to rise up, murder whites, and take over. But Manson believed that blacks were not intelligent enough to run the country, so they would eventually need help. And who would give them that help? Manson and his family, of course, who would survive the war hidden in a secret desert cave. Manson believed this cave existed somewhere in Death Valley, a vast underground civilization where his family would hide while the carnage unfolded above. When the war ends, Manson will emerge as the new leader and take control of the world. He will rule as king in a new world order. Manson wove this entire theory together from the Bible, specifically the Book of Revelation, the songs of the Beatles, and his own paranoid imagination. He spent endless hours explaining to his family how every Beatles song contained a hidden message. Blackbird was about the Black Uprising. Piggies was about rich white people getting killed. Revolution 9 was a numerological prophecy, and Helter Skelter was the name for the whole apocalypse. They were waiting for a sign that Helter Skelter was starting. Manson listened to the news, looking for evidence of racial tension in America. And when it seemed the war wasn't coming fast enough, he decided to start it himself. And that was the backdrop for the murders that followed. Manipulation through drugs and psychological coercion. How did Manson maintain such control over his followers? How did he get normal young people to believe these insane theories and be willing to kill on his orders? The answer is disturbingly simple: drugs and psychological manipulation. Drugs were an integral part of life at Spahn Ranch. LSD, marijuana, mescaline, all were constantly available. Manson literally overloaded his followers with drugs, especially LSD. While they were tripping, he stayed sober or took much smaller doses. Then he would talk to them for hours and hours, putting his thoughts into their heads while their minds were open and vulnerable. Imagine being on a powerful LSD trip and someone you trust whispering in your ear that you are the chosen ones, that you are part of something bigger, that together you will save the world. In that altered state of consciousness, it all makes sense. And when you hear it again and again, day after day, week after week, it becomes your reality. But it wasn't just the drugs. Manson was a master of psychological manipulation. He used a technique we now call love bombing, showering new members with love, attention, and acceptance, then alternately withdrawing and returning that love, creating a cycle of dependency. If someone doubted or rebelled, they were humiliated in front of the others or temporarily expelled from the group. The fear of losing family was so strong that most people did anything rather than risk exclusion. Manson also systematically fractured the individual identities of his followers. He told them that their previous lives were lies, that their families did not love them, that society had betrayed them. He was creating a new reality where he was the only one telling them the truth. He isolated them from the outside world, from their families and friends. There were no telephones at Spahn Ranch. They rarely read the newspaper, and contact with reality was minimal. Preparing for the revolution. As the year 1969 approached, Manson's rhetoric became increasingly dark and urgent. Helter-skelter was coming at any moment, and the family had to be ready. Preparations for this revolution took a concrete and frightening form. Manson began to train his followers in combat. He taught them how to use knives effectively. Yes, knives, not guns. Manson believed knives were more personal, quieter, and more effective in close-quarters warfare. They spent hours practicing stabbing moves, learning how to quickly and quietly disable the enemy. He also sent them on night missions, creepy-crawly expeditions as he called them. The followers would break into the homes of sleeping people, move about the house, rearrange furniture, open windows, but steal nothing. The point was to show that they could break in anywhere, anytime, without being detected. It was a terrifying exercise that prepared them for what was to come. Manson also began to talk more specifically about what it would take to launch Helter Skelter. He talked about the need for someone to show the blacks how to do it. In other words, to commit murders and frame blacks to provoke a race war. His rhetoric changed from abstract philosophical musings to concrete plans for violence. The atmosphere at the ranch became increasingly dark. Laughter and music were replaced by tension and fear. Everyone sensed that something was afoot. Manson picked out those he trusted most, the most dedicated, those who would do anything for him. And he was preparing them to cross that final line, the line between life and death. And it was in this atmosphere, saturated with drugs, manipulation, bizarre theories, and preparations for the apocalypse, that the events that shocked the world occurred. And now we come to the hardest part of this story, the nights that changed American society forever and ended the era of 1960s innocence. I must warn you in advance that the following information is very disturbing. I won't go into all the graphic details, but it's still a heavy subject. August 8th, 1969. The murders at Sharon Tate's house. Leslie was not present. On the evening of the 8th of August, Manson gave the order. He singled out 4 members of his family, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. Their destination was a house at number 10,050 Cielo Drive in the upscale Benedict Canyon neighborhood of Los Angeles. Manson knew the house. It had previously been the home of music producer Terry Melcher, who had turned Manson down and failed to secure him a recording contract. It was something Manson never forgave. What he didn't know was that Melcher had long since moved out, and the house was now rented by director Roman Polanski and his pregnant wife, Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate was a 28-year-old Hollywood star at the time, a beautiful actress with a promising career. She was 9 months pregnant, and her husband, Roman Polanski, was in Europe shooting a film. Sharon wasn't alone. She had a visitor. Her ex-boyfriend and famous Hollywood hairdresser Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and her boyfriend Wojciech Frykowski. The group arrived at the house around midnight. Linda Kasabian remained with the car as driver and lookout. Tex Watson climbed the fence and cut the telephone wires. Then all 3 broke into the house. What happened there over the next hour was something so brutal it shocked even hardened detectives. Tex Watson shot and killed 18-year-old Stephen Parent, who happened to be leaving the house. He was working as a janitor and was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then the trio made it to the main house. They gathered all 4 people together in the living room. Wojciech Frykowski tried to escape, but was brutally stabbed and shot on the front lawn. Abigail Folger also tried to escape, but was caught and stabbed 28 times. Jay Sebring was shot as he tried to protect Sharon. And Sharon Tate, a pregnant woman pleading for the life of her unborn child, was stabbed 16 times. Susan Atkins later testified that Sharon pleaded, "Please let me live. I just want my baby to live." But no mercy came. Before they left, they wrote the word pig, pig, in blood on the front door. It was a message, part of the plan to make it look like a racially motivated murder and start helter-skelter. In all, 102 stab wounds were counted at the scene. Leslie Van Houten stayed at the Spahn Ranch that night. She was not selected for this mission. But when the others returned, they told her everything. They described it with terrifying enthusiasm, as if they had just done something heroic. And Leslie? Leslie listened. And she didn't interrupt. She didn't report it. She stayed. August 10th, 1969. The LaBianca murders. The following evening, August 10th, Manson decided to show the others how to do it right. This time he went with them personally, and this time he chose Leslie Van Houten. This was her night, the night that made her a killer. Manson took 6 people, himself, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and Linda Kasabian. They drove through dark Los Angeles looking for more victims. Manson drove and eventually stopped in the Los Feliz neighborhood in front of a house he said he picked at random. But it wasn't a completely random choice. Manson had been there earlier for a party at a neighboring house. The house was occupied by 44-year-old Leno LaBianca, the owner of a chain of grocery stores, and his 38-year-old wife, Rosemary, who ran a clothing boutique. They were successful, wealthy, middle-class people. They had just returned from a trip and had no idea what was in store for them. Manson and Tex first broke into the house alone. Leno was sleeping on the sofa in the living room. They woke him up with a gun pointed at his head. Manson reassured him, told him nothing would happen, that it was just a robbery. Rosemary was in the bedroom. Manson led her into the living room. He tied both husbands up and told them he wouldn't hurt them. Then Manson left. He returned to the car and sent Leslie, Patricia, and Tex inside. He gave them a clear order: kill them. And they did. Leslie actively participated in the murder of Rosemary LaBianca. We have to stop here at Leslie Van Houten's role because this is what she was convicted of. Leslie was assigned to Rosemary LaBianca. Her job was to kill this woman. Rosemary was taken back to her bedroom. She was still tied up, but she could hear what was going on in the living room. She heard her husband calling out and then the horrible noises. She knew what was coming, and when Patricia and Leslie entered the bedroom, she began to fight for her life. Rosemary fought fiercely. Even when she was tied up, she kicked, she screamed, she tried anything. Patricia began to stab, but Rosemary fought back. Leslie joined in. They held her down, stabbed her. Rosemary still fought back with an incredible force of desperation. Patricia called out to Tex for help. Tex came and helped them overpower her. And here comes the scariest part of Leslie's involvement. With Rosemary presumably dead or dying, Leslie took the knife and continued stabbing. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't a fight. It was pure violence against a defenseless or already dead victim. She confessed to 16 stab wounds. Leslie Van Houten later admitted her involvement during interrogations and court proceedings. She said she stabbed Rosemary LaBianca 16 times. 16 times, she plunged a knife into the body of another human being. She described it coldly, almost mechanically. She said she felt like she wasn't doing it, like she was watching someone else. She tried to explain that when she came into the bedroom, Rosemary was probably already dead, that her wounds were only to a dead body. But the forensic autopsy showed otherwise. Some of the wounds were inflicted post-mortem, but some weren't. And even if they were all post-mortem, what does that say about a man who can stab a dead body? Leslie also admitted to going into the kitchen and eating after the murders. Yes, you heard right. After killing 2 people, she got something to eat from their fridge. How can a person do something so horrible and then just go eat? How does one's humanity shut down so completely? In later interviews, Leslie described being in a sort of trance during the murders, that the drugs, the exhaustion, and the months of Manson's indoctrination had turned her into someone else, that she wasn't the one who did it, but it was her. Her hands were holding the knife. Her power stabbed into Rosemary LaBianca. The brutal way the crime was committed, the overall picture of both nights is something that's hard to grasp. It wasn't just murder, it was something much darker. It was the execution of innocent people in a way that was meant to evoke maximum horror. In the LaBianca home, the word war, was found carved into Len LaBianca's abdomen. Yes, carved into his body with a knife. Written in blood on the walls were the words, "Death to pigs," and "Rise." In the fridge, they left a knife stuck in Len's throat. And on the wall, they misspelled "Helter Skelter." It was all staged. It was supposed to look like the work of militant blacks, the beginning of a race war. They used words from Beatles songs, left deliberately chaotic clues, but most of all, they caused unimaginable horror. Rosemary LaBianca had a total of 41 stab wounds. 41. Leno had 12 knife wounds and was still stabbed with a fork that remained lodged in his abdomen. The victims at the Cielo Drive house had over 100 wounds in all. This is not a killing of necessity. That's rage. That's pure hatred or a complete loss of humanity. And perhaps most frighteningly, the perpetrators were not professional killers. They were young people, mostly from good families, living normal lives until a few years ago. Tex Watson was a former athlete and student. Patricia Krenwinkel was a quiet, shy girl. Susan Atkins was a teenager looking for love. And Leslie Van Houten was a former cheerleader with good grades. How did people like that become murderers? It's a question that has haunted psychologists, criminologists, and the public for decades. Was it mind control, drugs, manipulation? Or was there something dark deep inside these people just waiting for an opportunity to come out? When they all returned to the Spahn Ranch that night, they changed clothes, burned their bloody clothes, and went to sleep. As if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't just destroyed 7 lives, 5 in Sharon Tate's house, 2 in the LaBianca house, plus Sharon's unborn child. 8 lives ended in absolute horror. Los Angeles was in shock. 2 days apart, 2 different locations, 7 dead. And the police had no idea who did it or why. It began a manhunt for the killers that would last months. And the fear that spread through Los Angeles was palpable. If it could have happened to Sharon Tate in her secure home, it could have happened to anyone. These murders weren't just a crime. They were a symbol of the end of an era. The end of the hippie dream. The end of the idea that love and peace would prevail. The Manson family showed that absolute evil could flourish even in a flower power environment. And now we come to how justice finally managed to bring the perpetrators of these horrific acts to justice. I have to say that the road to arrest was full of twists and turns, and if it weren't for a few coincidences and one brave witness, Manson and his followers may never have been brought to justice. Arrested in November 1969. For weeks after the murders, the police floundered. They had no suspects, no clear motives, no connection between the 2 crime scenes. Detectives worked the 2 cases separately, not even thinking they might be connected. The investigation revolved around Hollywood celebrities, possible drug deals, various conspiracy theories, but it didn't lead to the Manson family. The break came from somewhere else. On October 16th, a raid was conducted on the Barker Ranch in Death Valley, where the Manson family had moved after the murders. The police didn't go there because of the murders. They went there because of car theft and arson. Manson and his followers were arrested for completely different crimes. Leslie Van Houten was among those arrested. But the key to cracking the case didn't come until November. Susan Atkins, one of those involved in the murders, was arrested for another crime and held in jail. And there she did something that opened the case. She started bragging. She told her cellmate Virginia Graham about the murders. She detailed what happened at Sharon Tate's house. Virginia reported it to the authorities. When this information reached investigators, it all started to come together. Suddenly, they had a connection. Suddenly, they had a suspect. They started mapping the Manson family, tracking their movements, looking for evidence. And slowly, piece by piece, they began to build a case. Linda Kasabian, who was present at both murders as the driver, also played an important role. Linda was horrified by what she saw and finally decided to cooperate with the authorities in exchange for immunity. Her testimony was crucial. She provided an inside view, describing what happened, who was there, who did what. On November 25th, Susan Atkins was formally charged with the murder of Gary Hinman, another Manson family victim. And during December, charges also began to be dropped for the Tate LaBianca murders. On the 8th of December, Charles Manson was indicted. Leslie Van Houten was formally charged along with other members of the group. The arrest sparked a media frenzy. When the public learned who was behind these horrific murders, it was a shock. It was not professional killers. It was not the mafia. It was not militant extremists. It was a group of young hippies led by a tiny, wild-eyed man who claimed to be the Messiah. America couldn't believe its eyes. The trial in the year 1971. The trial began on June 15, 1971, and lasted 9 months. It became one of the longest and most expensive trials in California history up to that time. It was also one of the most bizarre trials the American justice system had ever seen. The defendants were Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. Tex Watson was tried separately because of legal complications. The lead prosecutor was the ambitious Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi, who later became famous for a book about the case called Helter Skelter. The trial took place in a Los Angeles courthouse and attracted enormous media attention. Every day there were crowds of reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers outside the building. The courtroom was always packed. This case fascinated America. The combination of Hollywood celebrities, hippie culture, sectarian violence, and bizarre themes was like something out of a horror movie. Bugliosi built his case on several pillars. First, he had the testimony of Linda Kasabian, who detailed what happened both nights. Second, he had forensic evidence, fingerprints, blood, guns. Third, he had the testimony of Susan Atkins, which she gave to the grand jury. And fourth, he had motivation, the helter-skelter theory, which he used to explain why these seemingly senseless murders occurred. Linda Kasabian was the star of the prosecution. She testified for 28 days. She described life in the Manson family, Manson's control of the group, the preparation for the murders, and then the events of the 2 nights themselves. Her testimony was emotional, detailed, and devastating to the defense. Although she was present at both murders, she was given immunity for cooperating with authorities. The defense tried to cast doubt on Linda's testimony, pointing to her drug use, the fact that she was given immunity in exchange for testifying. They tried to portray her as not credible, but her testimony was consistent and supported by other evidence. The forensic evidence was also strong. Patricia Krenwinkel's fingerprints were found at the crime scene. Clothing with the victim's blood on it was found. The weapon used in the murders was recovered. Bit by bit, Bugliosi built a bulletproof case. As for Leslie Van Houten specifically, the evidence against her was clear. Linda Kasabian testified that Leslie was present during the LaBianca murders. Forensic evidence confirmed her involvement, and later, Leslie's own statements confirmed what she did: behavior in court, laughing and singing with the other members. But what made this trial truly bizarre was the defendant's behavior. It was clear from day one that this was not going to be a normal trial. Manson and his girls decided to turn the courtroom into a stage for their performance. On the first day of the trial, all 4 defendants came into the courtroom with X's carved on their foreheads. Yes, they actually carved a big X into the skin of their foreheads. Manson did it first, telling reporters he'd cut himself off from your world. The girls immediately followed suit. They later changed that X into a swastika, the Nazi symbol. Throughout the trial, the defendants acted as if it were a game. They laughed, they sang, they grimaced. When Linda Kasabian testified, all 3 girls stared at her with blank eyes and twisted their faces, trying to intimidate her. When the judge spoke, they turned their backs on him. When the evidence was presented, they giggled. Leslie Van Houten was part of the spectacle. She sat next to Susan and Patricia, and all 3 of them acted as a unit. They dressed the same, had the same hairstyles, moved in sync. It was terrifying. They looked like robots programmed by Manson. Manson himself was unpredictable in the courtroom. He once jumped up and tried to attack the judge with a paring knife. Other times he yelled at the judge, accusing him, making bizarre statements. He had to be escorted out of the courtroom several times, but even though he wasn't physically present, his influence over the girls was obvious. Outside the courthouse, other members of the Manson family were gathering, but they were not arrested. They were sitting on the sidewalk holding vigils, singing Manson songs. They also carved X's on their foreheads. It was like a public show of devotion to their leader. The media loved it, of course. It was perfect footage for the evening news. During the trial, the defense tried different strategies. First, they claimed their clients were innocent. Then they tried to impeach the witnesses. Then they argued that Manson had no direct control over what the girls were doing. But none of it worked. The evidence was too strong. Interestingly, during the trial, all 3 girls tried to take the blame and exonerate Manson. They wanted to testify that they did it all on their own without his orders. But Bugliosi proved that this was just more manipulation on Manson's part. He was trying to save himself at the expense of his followers. The original death sentence. After a 9-month trial on March 25, 1971, the jury delivered its verdict. All 4 defendants were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Leslie Van Houten was found guilty of 2 counts of murder, that of Len and Rosemary LaBianca. The sentencing phase followed. Bugliosi called for the death penalty. The defense sought the jury's sympathy, arguing the defendants' young age, their manipulated state, and their potential for rehabilitation. But the jury was adamant. On April 19, 1971, the jury recommended the death penalty for all 4 defendants. On April 29, Judge Charles Older officially handed down the death sentence. Leslie Van Houten, who was 20 years old at the time of the murders, was sentenced to death in the gas chamber. When the sentence was handed down, Leslie showed no emotion. She sat there with a blank expression, holding hands with Susan and Patricia. All 3 looked almost proud, as if the death sentence was some badge of honor. Manson also showed no remorse or fear. Outside the courtroom, members of the Manson family celebrated. Yes, you heard that right. Celebrating. They saw the death sentence as a victory, as an affirmation of their importance, as a martyrdom. It was absolutely surreal. Leslie Van Houten was taken to a women's prison in California to await execution. She was the youngest woman sentenced to death in California. She was 22 years old and facing death in the gas chamber. Her story seemed to end, but as life goes, fate had other plans. Changing to life in the year 1972 after California abolished the death penalty. A year later, on February 18, 1972, something unexpected came. The California Supreme Court ruled in People v. Anderson that the death penalty violated the California Constitution. The death penalty was struck down as unconstitutional. This decision had an immediate impact on all death row inmates in California, including Charles Manson, Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel. Their death sentences were automatically commuted to life in prison with the possibility of parole. For Leslie, this meant that instead of facing death in the gas chamber, she now faced life behind bars. But with one key difference: she was eligible for parole. Once every few years, she could petition the parole board for release. This change was controversial to many people. Victims' families were devastated. They felt that justice had been betrayed, that their loved ones' killers had been given a second chance that their loved ones never had. For them, the change in sentence was like another blow. For Leslie, it marked the beginning of a very long journey. A journey that was to last more than 5 decades. A journey filled with appeals, hearings, denials, and hope. But that's a story for another chapter. The Manson family trial has become legendary. It was a symbol of the dark side of the 60s, the end of the hippie dream. It showed how far manipulation can go, how fragile the line between sanity and insanity is, and he raised questions about guilt, responsibility, and the possibility of redemption that still resonate today. And now we look at how Leslie Van Houten spent decades behind bars. Because it wasn't just time spent in a cell. It was a process of transformation, repentance, and a fight for a second chance. I have to say that when I researched her life in prison, it was one of the most interesting aspects of the whole story. 53 years behind bars, imagine 53 years. 53 years of your life spent in prison. That's more than twice my current age. That's a lifetime. Leslie Van Houten entered prison as a 20-year-old young woman in the year 1969 and left as a 73-year-old grandmother in the year 2023. When you think about it, it's almost unimaginable. Most of us can't even fathom what it's like to spend such a long time in one place, cut off from the normal world. Leslie has spent her entire adult life behind bars. She never had a home of her own. She never had a career. She never had children. Never traveled where she wanted to go. She's never done the thousands of things we take for granted. In those 53 years, the world outside has changed dramatically. When Leslie entered prison, There were no computers, no cell phones, no internet. When she came out, people carried the world in their pockets. The music she listened to when she was young became oldies. Movies that were new are now classics. Presidents came and went. Wars began and ended. And she watched it all from prison. The California Institution for Women in Chino became her home. This medium-security women's prison was where Leslie spent most of her incarceration. She shared space with hundreds of other women, each with her own story, her own crime, her own grief. The daily routine in prison is monotonous. Wake-up call at 6 in the morning, breakfast in the canteen, work or educational programs, lunch, more work or programs, dinner, free time in cell or common areas, lights out at 10 p.m., and then the same again the next day, and another day, and another day, for 53 years, gradual change of attitude and regret. But something has changed over the years. Leslie Van Houten, who came to prison as a devoted Manson family member, who laughed in court and sang Manson songs, began to undergo a transformation. And that transformation was slow, painful, and profound. The first years were the hardest. Leslie was still living under Manson's influence, even though he was in a men's prison far from her. She still believed in his philosophy, still considered herself part of the family. She refused to accept full responsibility for what she had done. She blamed drugs, she blamed Manson, she blamed society, but not herself. The break came gradually. Staying away from Manson helped. Therapy helped. But mostly, time helped. As Leslie grew older, as her brain matured, as the effect of years of manipulation and drugs faded, she began to see the truth. She began to see the horror of what she had done. She began to see Rosemary LaBianca not as an abstract, not as a piggy bank in the Manson war, but as a real person. A woman who had a family, friends, dreams. A woman who wanted to live. The psychologists who worked with Leslie described her process as real. It wasn't a superficial contrition designed to fool the parole board. It was a deep, existential confrontation with what she had done. Leslie began to cry. She started having nightmares. She began to wake up knowing that she had killed a man and that she had to live with that every day for the rest of her life. In interviews she gave later, Leslie described waking up every morning with the weight of her guilt. How she reminded herself every day that she had taken a life she couldn't get back. How she apologized to the LaBianca family over and over again, even though she knew no apology would ever be enough. This transformation was not quick. It took years, maybe decades. But according to those who knew Leslie in prison, guards, therapists, fellow inmates, the change was real. A young woman who came to prison as a manipulated cult member became a mature woman who fully accepted responsibility for her actions. Getting a college education in prison. One of the most remarkable aspects of Leslie's life in prison was her education. Instead of just counting down the days, she decided to use her time constructively. And that meant learning. Leslie began studying during her first years in prison. First, it was basic courses, completing her high school education, which she interrupted when she joined the Manson family. Then she began to move up. She enrolled in college courses available to prisoners. In the year 1977, just 6 years after entering prison, Leslie earned a bachelor's degree in English literature. Imagine that, studying Shakespeare and Dickens in a prison cell where you are convicted of murder. But Leslie did it. She read hundreds of books, wrote essays, participated in debates. But she didn't stop at a bachelor's degree. She moved on. She studied psychology, sociology, the humanities. She wanted to understand not only literature but also the human mind, perhaps above all her own mind. She wanted to understand how she became what she was, how she could have done what she did. In the 1980s, Leslie earned her master's degree. Yes, a master's degree. From prison. How many people on the outside have master's degrees? And she did it behind bars with limited resources, endless obstacles. Her education wasn't just about getting a degree, it became her salvation, her way of staying sane during the endless years of incarceration. Books became her windows to a world she couldn't visit. Learning became her purpose when everything else was taken away. Leslie also began to teach other women prisoners. She helped those who couldn't read or write. She led study groups. She mentored younger inmates. She used her education to help others, to do something positive in an environment full of negativity. Exemplary behavior as a prisoner. By all reports from prison staff, Leslie Van Houten was a model prisoner. And this is not a platitude. She was indeed considered one of the best female prisoners in the system. Leslie never had any disciplinary problems. In 53 years. Not one serious incident. No violence, no drugs, no rule violations. That's an almost unbelievable record in an environment where conflict is common and rules are often broken. The guards who worked with her for decades spoke of her with respect. They described her as calm, considerate, dependable. They said that if they hadn't known her history, they would never have guessed that she had been convicted of murder. She came across as someone who shouldn't have been there, intelligent, educated, kind. Leslie worked in various positions in prison. She worked in the library, where she helped catalog books and helped other inmates find reading material. She worked in administration, where her organizational skills were highly valued. She worked as a tutor, helping other women prisoners with their studies. Her fellow inmates also spoke positively about her. In an environment where it can be difficult to find allies, where rivalries and tensions prevail, Leslie was respected. She wasn't a gangster, she wasn't violent, she wasn't manipulative. She was quiet, hardworking, helpful. Interestingly, Leslie never tried to hide her past. Everyone knew who she was. The Manson family was too famous to keep it a secret. But instead of using it as an identity, as a way to gain respect or fear, Leslie carried it as a burden. She talked about it openly, but with shame, not pride. Participation in rehabilitation programs. Leslie also actively participated in every rehabilitation program available, and there were a lot of them. Programs to address substance use disorders, even though her addiction to drugs was long in the past. Programs for victims of domestic violence, because she too was in some sense a victim of manipulation, not physical violence, but still a victim. Anger management programs, programs for developing empathy. Therapy became an important part of Leslie's life. Individual therapy, group therapy, trauma-focused therapy. She spent thousands of hours in therapy sessions, examining her past, her family, her choices. She worked to understand how she got to where she was, how she went from an ordinary teenager to a murderer. One of the therapists who worked with Leslie for years later testified before the parole board. He said Leslie was an example of true rehabilitation, that she understood the roots of her actions, that she took full responsibility, that she developed the tools to ensure that she would never return to such behavior. He said that if every prisoner worked as hard on themselves as Leslie did, the prison system would look very different. Leslie also participated in victim programs. This is a program where offenders must face the impact of their actions on victims and their families. It must have been incredibly painful for Leslie, listening to the stories of families who have lost loved ones, to see their tears, their anger, their pain, and to know that she caused the same pain to the LaBianca family. She has also participated in violence prevention programs, speaking to younger women inmates about the consequences of violence. She shared her story not as a warning about how she was manipulated, but as a warning about how easily you can lose yourself if you're not careful, how important critical thinking is, how dangerous cults and manipulative people are. Leslie has also been involved in spiritual programs. She started studying Buddhism, meditation, mindfulness. She was looking for ways to find peace with what she had done, how to live with the weight. Buddhism provided her with a framework for understanding suffering, how she caused the suffering, and how to live with it. Her participation in these programs was not mandatory. Many women prisoners do the minimum they must. But Leslie was doing the maximum. She signed up for every program that was available. She volunteered. She was actively involved. Because she knew it was the only thing she could do. She couldn't turn back the clock. She can't bring Rosemary LaBianca back to life, but she can work to make her a better person. And she did that every day for 53 years. The prison system has two goals, punishment and rehabilitation. Leslie Van Houten definitely got punished. 53 years behind bars is an incredibly long sentence. But when it comes to rehabilitation, by any measure, Leslie was an example of what that should look like. She transformed herself from a manipulated killer into an educated, compassionate, productive person. The question that divided the public for decades was, is that enough? Does she deserve a second chance? And that's a question everyone must answer for themselves. And now we come to the part of the story that has spanned decades and that has shown just how complicated the justice system can be. Leslie Van Houten fought for her freedom for over 40 years, and what happened during that time is a story in itself. More than 20 denied parole applications. Leslie had her first chance at a parole hearing in 1978, just 7 years after entering prison. And since then, a marathon that was to last more than 4 decades began. Imagine that. Going before the board over and over again, telling her story, explaining her actions, demonstrating her change, and being rejected. Over and over and over again. In total, Leslie has had more than 20 parole hearings. 20. Each hearing meant months of preparation. It meant gathering documents about her behavior in prison, her education, her therapeutic progress. It meant finding people to testify on her behalf, psychologists, prison guards, therapists. It meant preparing herself emotionally for having to talk about the worst night of her life over and over again. Each hearing went much the same way. Leslie sat before a panel of usually 3 to 5 members. She had to answer questions about the murders, what exactly she did, why she did it, how she felt about it. She had to demonstrate that she understood the gravity of her actions. She had to explain how she had changed. She had to show that she wouldn't be dangerous if she was released. And at each of those first hearings, there was a denial. Release denied. Come back next year. Or 2 years. Or 3. And Leslie would go back to her cell, wait another year, and then do it all over again. The reasons for rejection varied. Sometimes the board said there hadn't been enough rehabilitation. Sometimes they said the severity of the crime was too great. Sometimes they just said, "Not yet," without a detailed explanation. It must have been incredibly frustrating for Leslie, doing everything right, changing, growing, and still getting no's. Support from psychologists and prison staff. But Leslie was not alone. As the years passed, she began to gain powerful allies, professionals who worked with her and saw her transformation firsthand. The psychologists who examined Leslie before the hearings consistently came to the same conclusion. She posed a low risk of reoffending. That's a technical way of saying she is very unlikely to reoffend. Their reports described her deep remorse, her understanding of what she had done, her development as a person. One forensic psychologist who had examined Leslie multiple times over the years wrote in his report that he had never seen a case of deeper transformation. He described how Leslie not only understood her involvement in the murders, but also the dynamics of manipulation and control that led her there. He wrote that she developed strong mechanisms to ensure that she would never be manipulated again. Prison staff also publicly supported her release. Guards who had worked with Leslie for decades wrote letters of support. They described her as a model prisoner, someone who helped keep the peace in prison, who mentored other women, who set an example of what rehabilitation could mean. The directors of the prisons where Leslie was held also expressed their support. This is rare. Prison officials do not usually take public positions on the release of specific prisoners. But in Leslie's case, many felt that justice demanded recognition of her change. Even some of the lawyers and judges who initially worked on her sentencing later said they believed she should be released. They acknowledged that while her crime was horrible, 50 years was more than enough time to pay her debt to society. The resistance of the victims' families. On the other side stood the families of the victims, and their voice was strong, emotional, and fully understandable. For them, no amount of years, no rehabilitation, no change could bring back their loved ones. Anthony DeMaria, the nephew of Jay Sebring, one of the victims in the Sharon Tate house, was particularly vocal in his opposition to the release of anyone from the Manson family. Although Leslie was not present when his uncle was murdered, DeMaria argued that all members of the group were equally guilty. He said a release would be an insult to the victim's memory. Members of the LaBianca family also regularly appeared at Leslie's hearings. Kathy LaBianca, Len LaBianca's daughter from a previous marriage, was particularly active. She described how the murders had devastated her family, how she never got over the loss of her father, how the idea that his killer could walk the streets free was unbearable to her. These testimonies of the victims' families were always the most difficult part of the hearings. Leslie had to sit and listen as her actions forever scarred the lives of innocent people. She had to see their tears, hear their anger, and there was nothing she could do except repeat the apologies she knew would never be enough. The families of the victims argued that the gravity of the crime should outweigh any rehabilitation, that some crimes are so horrible that they deserve a life sentence without the possibility of release, that Leslie should have been sentenced to life without parole from the start. The governor's 5 times revoked parole approval. And then something unprecedented began. The parole board, made up of experts, began approving Leslie for release, and the governors of California started overturning those decisions. Leslie was first approved for release in April of 2016. After more than 40 years behind bars, after all those denials, the board finally said yes. They recognized her rehabilitation, her low risk, her transformation. Leslie and her lawyers celebrated. Finally, it seemed, justice had prevailed. But then Governor Jerry Brown stepped in. In July of 2016, he used his power to overturn the commission's decision. He wrote that while he recognized Leslie's progress, he still posed an unreasonable risk to the public. His reasoning was controversial. It went against the recommendations of the experts who had actually worked with Leslie. A year later, in September 2017, the commission again approved Leslie for dismissal, and again, Governor Brown reversed the decision. This time in January of 2018. A pattern seemed to have set in. The commission says yes, the governor says no. In January 2019, a third approval came from the commission. And in June of 2019 came the third denial from Governor Brown. His reasoning was similar to the previous one, the seriousness of the crime and the alleged risk to the public. In July 2019, after Brown left office, Leslie had another hearing. The new governor was Gavin Newsom. The commission approved her again, for the 4th time. That was in September 2019, and in October 2019 Governor Newsom also reversed the decision. 5 times. 5 times Leslie was approved by experts who had studied her case, who had read thousands of pages of documents, who had heard hours of testimony. And 5 times, politically elected officials said no, legal battles and appeals. These repeated denials have sparked an intense legal battle. Leslie's lawyers argued that the governor's actions were unconstitutional, that they violated the principle of separation of powers, and that they ignored facts and expert recommendations. They appealed to the courts, arguing that the decisions were politically motivated rather than based on a true assessment of risk. They pointed out that Leslie met all the criteria for release: excellent prison conduct, low risk of reoffending, deep remorse, strong plan for life after release. The courts were in a difficult position. On the one hand, California law gives the governor the power to overrule parole board decisions. On the other hand, this authority should be used only when there is legitimate reason to believe the prisoner poses a risk. The Leslie case has become a test of how far the governor can go in disregarding expert recommendations. It has become emblematic of a larger tension in the justice system between rehabilitation and punishment, between expert judgment and political will. Leslie Van Houten's case has sparked debates that go beyond just her personal story. It has become a symbol of much larger questions about justice, guilt, and the possibility of forgiveness. And I have to say, the more I thought about it, the more complicated it all seemed. There are no easy answers here. Was Leslie a victim of manipulation or fully responsible? This is the biggest question that has divided psychologists, lawyers, and the public. On the one hand, we have a young girl who was only 19 years old when she came to the Manson family. She was vulnerable, searching for meaning in her life, under the influence of drugs, and subjected to months of intense psychological manipulation by a man who was a master at controlling others. Experts in cults and cult psychology pointed out that Leslie showed all the signs of a person under cult control. She was isolated from family and friends. She was bombarded with ideology for hours a day. She was kept in a state of physical exhaustion and chemical dependency. Her identity was systematically dismantled and rebuilt to Manson's specifications. Doctors who study cult psychology explain that the human brain is not fully developed at age 19, especially the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision-making and judging consequences. Leslie was at her most vulnerable age, old enough to be criminally responsible but young enough to be extremely impressionable. Proponents of this view argued that Leslie was essentially brainwashed, that on the night of the murders she was not acting of her own volition but as an extended arm of Charles Manson, that he was the real culprit and his followers were merely the tools of his madness. But on the other side is the argument of personal responsibility. Critics of this view say that regardless of the manipulation, Leslie still had a choice. She was not physically forced to take the knife. She wasn't held at gunpoint. At a critical moment, standing in that bedroom with Rosemary LaBianca, she had the option to say no. She had the option to walk away. But she didn't. This camp argues that to accept manipulation as an excuse would be to open a dangerous precedent. Any killer could say that he was influenced by someone else, that he was under pressure, that he was not in his normal state. Where would we draw the line between influence and self-selection? Interestingly, Leslie herself has been clear in this debate. She has consistently said in her later statements that yes, she was manipulated, but that does not absolve her of responsibility. She said that even in that influenced state, she had the option to walk away, she had the option to say no, and that the decision to stay with the Manson family and follow his orders was ultimately her choice. She accepted full responsibility, even as she acknowledged the context of manipulation, the influence of drugs and age on her actions. Another key point of debate was the effect of drugs on Leslie's ability to make decisions, and this is no small issue, as drugs played a huge role in the Manson family's life. Leslie was essentially always under the influence of some substance. LSD, marijuana, mescaline, speed, it was all part of everyday life at Spahn Ranch. Drug addiction experts explain that chronic use of psychedelic drugs, especially at such a young age, can seriously distort one's perception of reality. LSD specifically can cause what experts call ego dissolution, a state where the boundaries between self and others dissolve, where normal moral inhibitions fade. Combined with Manson's constant indoctrination, the drugs may have created a state where Leslie literally did not perceive reality in the same way as a sober person. Some studies also show that repeated LSD use at such a young age can have long-term effects on the brain. It can change the way a person processes information, how they assess risk, how they distinguish between right and wrong. Leslie's brain was at a critical developmental stage and was being bombarded with powerful psychotropic drugs. Then there's the question of age. 19 years old. We know a lot more about brain development today than we did in the 60s. Modern neuroscience shows that the human brain continues to develop into the mid-20s. The part of the brain responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and judging consequences is among the last to mature. This means that Leslie, at 19, literally did not have a fully developed ability to understand the full impact of her actions. Her brain was biologically predisposed to risk-taking behavior, to succumbing to peer pressure, to a lack of consideration for the future. Proponents of this view say the penal system should take age into account far more than it does. That sentencing a 19-year-old to life in prison is essentially punishing her for acts she committed when her brain was not yet fully capable of understanding their meaning. But again, critics argue that 19 is old enough to know that killing is wrong. That regardless of brain development, a basic moral consciousness should be present. That millions of 19-year-olds take drugs and do not participate in murder. Do they deserve a second chance after 53 years? This question may be the most emotional of all. Does someone who has committed such a brutal crime even deserve a second chance? And if so, how much time is enough? Those who believe in rehabilitation point out that the whole point of the prison system should be not only to punish, but also to rehabilitate. If a prisoner demonstrates genuine change, if he no longer poses a danger to society, if he has accepted responsibility and feels genuine remorse, what is the point of keeping him behind bars any longer? They argue that Leslie is a textbook example of successful rehabilitation. She has transformed herself from a manipulated cult member to an educated, empathetic person. She's spent more than 5 decades demonstrating her change. In any other case, a person with her profile would have been fired long before now. They also point out that the justice system should be consistent. People who have committed similarly serious or even worse crimes have been released after shorter periods of time. Why should Leslie be held longer just because her case was famous? Advocates of her release also argue that 53 years is an unimaginably long time. That's more than double the average sentence for murder. Leslie went into prison as a young woman and came out an old woman. She lost her whole life. If that's not paying a debt to society, what is? On the other side are those who believe that some acts are so horrible that they deserve permanent punishment. They argue that the severity of the crime should be the primary factor, not rehabilitation. That Leslie's involvement in the murders was so brutal, so cold-blooded, that no amount of years or change could make up for it. This camp points out that victims never get a second chance. Rosemary LaBianca never came out of that bedroom. She never saw her loved ones grow up. She never had a chance to grow old. Why should her killer have an opportunity she never had? Victims' views versus a rehabilitative approach. Here we come to a fundamental tension in the justice system. On the one hand, we have the rights and feelings of victims and their families. On the other side, we have the principles of rehabilitation and second chances. Victims' families have a perfectly legitimate right to anger, to grief, to want to see perpetrators punished. Their pain is real and lasting. For them, there is no rehabilitation that can compensate for the loss of their loved ones. Every anniversary, every holiday, every family reunion reminds them of an empty place at the table. Victims' rights advocates argue that their voices should carry primary weight in release decisions, that society has an obligation to victims and their families to ensure that justice is served not only at the time of sentencing, but throughout the entire sentence. But the rehabilitative approach argues that the justice system cannot be based solely on revenge or victim honors, important though these are. That the system must also serve broader societal goals, reducing recidivism, reintegrating offenders, treating them fairly. This approach says that keeping someone in prison who is no longer a danger just for a token punishment is not justice. It is revenge. And that revenge is not the goal of a civilized justice system. Media coverage of the case The Manson Family has always been a media sensation, and the Leslie case was no exception. Every parole hearing drew a flock of reporters. Every decision, approval or denial, made headlines. Media coverage had a huge impact on public perception of the case. Documentaries, articles, books, all shaped the narrative. Some presented Leslie as a lost child who had been manipulated and deserved compassion. Others presented her as a cold-blooded killer who should remain behind bars forever. This media attention also created political pressure. Governors knew that their decision to release Leslie would be watched and judged. Releasing a Manson family member could mean political suicide. This raises the question of whether politicians could ever make an objective decision or whether they were too influenced by public opinion. The Leslie Van Houten case became a mirror in which society saw its own values and contradictions. It was a test of whether we believe in forgiveness and second chances or whether we believe that some actions are unforgivable. And the answer, it turned out, was not simple. Finally, we come to the conclusion of this incredible story. After more than 5 decades behind bars, after endless fights and appeals, the moment Leslie Van Houten had been waiting for most of her adult life had arrived. And I have to say, the way it came about was surprising. July 2023. Final release from prison. On July 17, 2023, something historic happened. Leslie Van Houten, after 53 years behind bars, finally left the California Institution for Women. The date that many thought would never come had finally arrived. But the path to that day was not a straightforward one. In May of 2023, the California Court of Appeal issued a decision that changed everything. The court ruled that Governor Newsom did not have sufficient evidence to deny her parole. The justices criticized his decision as politically motivated and inconsistent with the parole board's factual findings. This court decision was a watershed. For the first time in the long process, Leslie had a legal victory that the governor could not easily ignore. The court essentially said that her release must go forward unless the governor found new, legitimate reasons to deny it. The weeks leading up to her release were fraught with tension. No one knew if there would be any final hurdle. The media attention was intense. Journalists gathered outside the prison, waiting for any news. The public was divided. Some celebrated the final justice. Others were outraged that the killer would be set free. On the morning of the 17th of July, Leslie was quietly escorted from the prison. There were no cameras, no microphones. Prison authorities tried to keep her departure as quiet as possible to avoid a media circus. Leslie got in her car and drove away from a place that had been her home for longer than most people have been alive. Imagine the moment. 53 years later, walking through those gates as a single woman, seeing the world not through bars but without any physical barriers, a world that had changed so dramatically in that time that it was almost unrecognizable from the one she left as a 20-year-old girl. Governor Gavin Newsom did not block parole. Perhaps the most surprising part of the entire parole process was what Governor Newsom did not do. After years of repeated denials, he didn't intervene this time. But it wasn't because he changed his mind or supported her release. It was a much more complicated situation. After the appeals court decision, Newsom technically still had the option of filing another appeal to the California Supreme Court. He could have asked for review of the lower court's decision, but he didn't. He let the deadline pass without action. It wasn't a tacit approval. Newsom's office issued a statement making it clear that they disagreed with the court's decision. They said they still believed Leslie was a risk and that her dismissal was a mistake. But this time, they did not use every legal means at their disposal to block it. Why? That's a question we can only speculate on. Perhaps they realized that another legal battle would be futile and that the courts had already made their position clear. Perhaps the political calculus changed, and the risk of further blocking outweighed the risk of dismissal. Maybe they were simply tired of a fight that had been going on for years. Some sources close to the governor's office suggested that Newsom was in a difficult position. On the one hand, he faced pressure from victims' families and conservative groups to continue the blockade. On the other, he faced criticism from lawyers and criminal justice reform advocates who argued that he was ignoring the law and expert recommendations. Whatever the reasons, the result was clear. For the first time in many years, the governor did not take active steps to stop Leslie's release, and that was enough. The legal machinery was set in motion, and on July 17th, Leslie walked free. At the age of 73, she left prison. Leslie Van Houten was 73 years old when she left prison. Let that go for a moment. 73 years old. She walked in as a young woman in her 20s and walked out as a senior citizen. Her entire adult life, all those years when most people are building careers, starting families, traveling, living life, she spent behind bars. Physically, Leslie has changed dramatically. Photos from her youth show a beautiful girl with long dark hair and a youthful face. Photos from her release show an older woman with gray hair and wrinkles carved by time. 53 years have left their mark. But it wasn't just physical change. Leslie was stepping out into a world that was radically different from the one she knew. In the year 1969, there were no computers in homes, no cell phones, no internet, no social media. Now, almost every aspect of modern life is digital. People order food through apps, communicate through text messages, navigate with GPS. Leslie had to learn all of this. In prison, she had limited access to technology. Now she had to function in a world where even basic tasks like shopping or paying bills required technological skills she never needed. She was also going out into a world where she was notorious. The Manson family case has remained in America's collective memory. Documentaries, podcasts, books, movies, all kept the story alive. Leslie couldn't just come out and start anonymously. Her face, her name was recognizable. This added another layer of complication to her reintegration. The conditions of release and supervision. Leslie was not released to complete freedom. Parole means exactly that. There are conditions, rules that she must follow. And violating those conditions could mean going back to prison. The primary condition was that Leslie had to live in a transitional facility. She couldn't just find an apartment and move in. She had to be in a controlled environment where she could be monitored and supported during her transition back into society. This facility provided structure to help her navigate her first months of freedom. Another requirement was regular contact with the parole officer. Leslie had to report regularly to prove where she was, what she was doing, who she was seeing. This supervision was to ensure that she was complying with all the conditions of her release and that she was successfully reintegrating. Leslie was also subject to regular drug and alcohol testing. Because drugs played such a significant role in her crimes, it was absolutely essential that she remain sober. Any positive test could have meant the immediate revocation of her release. She also had travel restrictions. She couldn't just go wherever she wanted. She had to get permission from her parole officer before leaving a certain geographic area. This restriction was to ensure that she remained within the range of supervision. Another condition was that Leslie had to find employment or engage in some productive activity. At 73, this was not easy. Who would hire a notorious killer at a senior age? But the terms of her release required that she contribute to society in some way. Leslie also wasn't allowed to contact the victims' families. Any attempted contact would be considered harassment and a violation of the terms. This rule protected families who had already suffered enough from any further trauma. Public and media reaction. When news of Leslie's release spread, reactions were tumultuous and deeply divided. Social media exploded with discussion. Articles appeared in every major media outlet, and television shows discussed the case. On one side were those who celebrated her release. Advocates of penal reform saw it as a victory. They argued that Leslie's case proves that rehabilitation is possible, that even people who have committed terrible crimes can make a difference. They pointed out that keeping a 73-year-old woman who posed minimal risk in prison was a waste of resources and a violation of the principles of justice. Some feminist groups also supported her release, arguing that Leslie was a victim of patriarchal manipulation. They pointed out that Manson, the real mastermind behind the crimes, died of natural causes, while his young female followers were punished for disproportionately long periods of time. On the other side were those who were outraged. Conservative commentators called it a betrayal of justice. Victims' family groups issued statements expressing their grief and anger. Social media was filled with comments from people who believed Leslie should never have been released. Some people organized protests. They demanded changes in the law to prevent similar firings in the future. They argued that the seriousness of the crime should be the primary factor, not rehabilitation or time spent in prison. Media coverage was intense. Television stations aired special programs. Newspapers published extensive articles examining every aspect of the case. Documentary filmmakers began working on updates to their Manson family films. Leslie's story, which had fascinated America for decades, was given a new chapter. Interestingly, some people who originally supported her incarceration changed their minds. They saw how long she had been behind bars, saw evidence of her transformation, and began to believe that justice had been served. Others who originally believed in her release had mixed feelings when they realized she was actually out. The case of Leslie Van Houten has once again become a national conversation about what justice means, about the limits of punishment and forgiveness, about the possibility of redemption. And as always, the answers were not easy and opinions were deeply divided. Now I want to reflect with you on what this story actually tells us, because Leslie Van Houten and the whole Manson family case is not just a historical curiosity. It is a warning, a lesson, and a mirror for our society. And I think it's important to take something more than just a shocking story away from it. The case as a warning against cults and manipulation. If one thing is abundantly clear from this story, it is the danger of cults and manipulative leaders, and that's not just a problem of the 1960s, it's a problem of today. Cults still exist, perhaps even in greater numbers than ever before. They just take different forms. Today we have online cults where charismatic influencers gather followers. We have political movements that use the same techniques of manipulation as Manson, isolation, bombardment with ideologies, creating a hostile image of the other. We have wellness communities, spiritual groups, even some corporate cultures that exhibit cult-like characteristics. What makes a cult so dangerous? It's a combination of factors. A charismatic leader who presents himself as having special knowledge or a connection to something higher. The isolation of members from their families and friends. Creating an us versus them mentality. Use of sleep deprivation, malnutrition, or substances to impair critical thinking. And gradually pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable until members do things they would never do outside of that group. Leslie's story shows us how quickly this can happen. She wasn't stupid. She wasn't from a bad family. She wasn't destined to be a criminal. But she found herself in a vulnerable moment in her life, and she ran into someone who knew exactly how to take advantage of that vulnerability. And in a matter of months, she transformed herself from an ordinary teenager into a killer. The warning here is clear: no one is immune to manipulation. Intelligence doesn't protect you. Good manners don't protect you. You can be the smartest person in the room and still end up in a cult if you get caught at the right time in the right way. We need to be aware of the techniques that manipulators use, and we need to be vigilant not only for ourselves, but for our loved ones as well. The importance of critical thinking. This brings me to perhaps the most important lesson: the absolute necessity of critical thinking. Leslie stopped asking questions. She accepted Manson's reality without question, and that was her biggest mistake. Critical thinking means constantly asking why, and is it true? It means verifying information from multiple sources. It means being willing to question authority, even when, and especially when, that authority claims to have all the answers. It means recognizing when someone is manipulating you with emotions instead of facts. In today's world, critical thinking is more important than ever. We live in an era of misinformation, fake news, conspiracy theories. Every day we are bombarded with news, opinions, facts that may or may not be true. Social media creates echo chambers where we only hear opinions that confirm what we already believe. Leslie allowed herself to be locked into the Manson family echo chamber. She heard only Manson's thoughts, repeated over and over until they became her reality. She had no access to alternative perspectives. She did not confront her beliefs with the outside world, and the result was disastrous. The lesson for us is: maintain diversity in your information sources. Talk to people who disagree with you. Actively seek out information that challenges your views. Be willing to say, "I don't know," or "maybe I'm wrong." These things are not weaknesses. They are signs of intellectual integrity. The rehabilitation versus punishment debate. The Leslie case also raises fundamental questions about the purpose of the penal system. What is the purpose of incarceration? Is it punishment? Is it the protection of society? Is it rehabilitation? Is it deterrence? Or some combination of all of these? If we believe that punishment is the primary goal, then maybe Leslie should never have been released. She committed a horrible crime and should suffer for it for the rest of her life, no matter how she's changed. This is retributive justice, an eye for an eye, a punishment that fits the crime. But if we believe that protecting society is the primary goal, then holding a 73-year-old woman who poses minimal risk makes no sense. We are wasting resources by holding someone who is not dangerous, when those resources could go to preventing new crimes or rehabilitating those who pose a real risk. And if we believe in rehabilitation, then Leslie is an example of how the system should work. She took a bad guy and transformed him. She used her time in prison to grow, to learn, to change. If we can't recognize and reward real rehabilitation, then what's the point of rehabilitation programs in the first place? The reality is that most people believe in some combination of these approaches. We want criminals to be punished, we want to be protected, and we want to believe that people can change. But how do we balance these sometimes conflicting goals? That's a question that society is still searching for an answer to. Leslie's case shows us the tension between these approaches in action. Experts said she was rehabilitated and posed no risk, but victims' families and the public wanted to see the punishment continue. Who's right? Maybe both. And maybe that's the problem. That we're looking for a simple answer to a complex question. The impact on changes in the justice system. The Manson family case has had a lasting impact on the American justice system. It has brought about changes in how we treat young offenders, how we understand cult manipulation, how the parole process works. After the Manson family, psychologists and lawyers began to study the phenomenon of cult control more closely. They began to understand how manipulation can affect criminal responsibility. Today, we have a much more sophisticated understanding of how cults work and how they influence their members. This understanding has influenced the defense in many cases involving cult members. The case has also influenced how we treat young offenders. The science of brain development, which shows that young people have a diminished ability to judge consequences, was inspired in part by cases like Leslie. Today, we have special considerations for young offenders in many jurisdictions, recognizing that teenagers are not just small adults, but have fundamentally different cognitive abilities. The parole process has also been affected. The Leslie case demonstrated the tension between expert recommendations and policy decisions. It has fought a debate about what role governors should play in parole decisions. Should they be able to trump experts, or should they respect the process? This debate continues. The Manson family as a cultural phenomenon. We cannot talk about legacy without acknowledging that the Manson family has become more than just a criminal case. It has become a cultural phenomenon. It has influenced films, music, literature, art. It became a symbol of the dark side of the American dream. The Manson family represented the end of a certain innocence. The 60s was a decade of hope, civil rights, the hippie movement, flower power. There was a belief that love could change the world. And then Manson came along and showed that even in an environment of peace and love, utter evil could flourish. It was a reality check that America never quite overcame. In popular culture, the Manson family became a fascination. Dozens of documentaries have been made, films made, hundreds of books written. Quentin Tarantino used the events as the backdrop for his film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Musicians have referenced Manson in songs. Artists have created works inspired by the case. This fascination says something about us as a society. We are drawn to the dark, to the extremes of human experience. We want to understand how normal people become monsters. The Manson family provides a case study of this transformation, and that's why it continues to fascinate us. But there is also a dark side to this fascination. Sometimes we risk glorifying the perpetrators instead of remembering the victims. Manson's name is common knowledge, but how many people remember the names of all the victims? This imbalance is problematic. We should study the case, learn from it, but we should never forget that at its heart are the real people who lost their lives. Conclusion. And that brings us to the end of this long and complex story. I have to say that the more I delved into the Leslie Van Houten case, the more I realized how complex and multi-layered it really is. Summary of the case. So, what did we learn? We saw the story of a young girl who went missing. Leslie Van Houten wasn't born a killer. She was a product of her time, her circumstances, and her fateful encounter with one of the most dangerous manipulators in American history. We've seen how quickly a person can lose themselves in a cult, how drugs, isolation, and a charismatic leader can transform one's moral compass. We have seen the brutal consequences of this transformation. Lives taken, families destroyed, a community traumatized. But we have also seen the possibility of change. We saw how Leslie spent more than 5 decades confronting what she had done, how she educated herself, grew, transformed, how she became a living example of what rehabilitation can mean. We have seen the tension in our justice system between punishment and forgiveness, between victims' rights and the possibility of redemption. We have seen how politics can influence justice, how media attention can distort the process, how public opinion can push back against expert recommendations. The moral questions that the case raises. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Can someone who has committed such a terrible act really be redeemed? Is 53 years enough? Is it too much? Where do we draw the line between justice and revenge? Can we forgive someone who took a life? And if we can, what does that forgiveness mean? Does it mean release from prison? Or can someone be forgiven but still kept behind bars? How do we balance the pain of victims' families with the principles of rehabilitation? Their suffering is real and lasting. But keeping someone in prison will not bring back their loved ones. Does it help their healing? Or does it just prolong the cycle of pain? What do we do with young offenders who have been manipulated? Where is the line between victim and perpetrator? Leslie was both a victim of Manson's manipulation and a perpetrator of horrible acts. How do we deal with that? These questions have no easy answers, and I think that's okay. Sometimes the most important thing is not to have an answer, but to be willing to ask. The current state of Leslie Van Houten today. Leslie is living under parole supervision. She is an old woman trying to navigate a world that has changed dramatically since she left it. According to reports, she lives quietly, avoiding the media, trying to live as normal a life as possible for someone with her past. She can't change what she's done. That night in August, 1969 will always be part of her story. Rosemary and Leno LaBianca will never get a second chance. Their family will never fully heal. That's the reality Leslie has to live with every day. But it also represents something else. The possibility that even those who have done the worst things can grow, change, become something other than their worst act. It doesn't mean we should forget or minimize what she did, but it does mean that the human capacity for change is stronger than we sometimes think. Call for discussion in the comments. And now I'd like to hear from you, because this isn't a story with a clear ending or a simple moral lesson. It's a story that raises questions and debates, and I want to know what you think about it. Do you believe Leslie deserved to be released? Or do you think she should have stayed in prison for the rest of her life? Where do you draw the line between justice and revenge? What do you think about the role of manipulation? Does it mitigate her guilt, or was she still fully responsible for her actions? If you were in Leslie's shoes, do you think you would have resisted Manson's influence? What about the parole system? Should governors have the power to override expert panels? Or should the process be purely based on facts and expert recommendations? Let me know in the comments what you think. Do you disagree with me? Perfect, tell me why. Do you have a different view? I want to hear it. These conversations are important. They help us all better understand the complex issues of justice, guilt, and forgiveness. Thanks to the audience, I want to thank you all for sticking with me to the end of this long video. I know it was a lot of information, a lot of heavy topics, but I think these stories are important to tell, not to glorify crime, but to learn from it. If you found this video interesting, please give it a like, share it with your friends who like true crime stories, and if you're new here, be sure to subscribe because I plan to bring you many more cases like this. Do you have a specific case you'd like me to make a video about? Let me know in the comments. I'm always looking for new stories to explore, and remember, be a critical thinker. Be alert to manipulation. Be kind to yourself and others, and never underestimate the importance of the decisions you make, because they can change the entire course of your life. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a great day.